my name's Leanne Barnes. I was the General Manager of Bega Valley Shire Council until July of 2021. Over the period of my being the General Manager at Bega Council, we were subject, sadly, to 15 declared natural disasters, of which several were large. Of course, the largest being the 1920 bushfires, but in 2018 we had two significant fire events, and in 2016 we had a significant East Coast low which battered the coast, creating quite a lot of damage. So whilst I've had a background a little bit in the emergency services space, very much my role more recently has been as the lead officer within a local government body working within a community, both in the local emergency management committee framework, but then also in the lead in recovery for a number of those events. In terms of answer to that question, and what advice would I give myself, my organisation, and community, I think looking back is to realise that the process of going through a significant disaster, then moving into relief and recovery, really has significant impacts on you as an individual. Sometimes those that you can't actually identify at the time and you only know about when you look back. And the main one for me was the impact of being in a highly adrenal-driven process for an extended period of time, and then experiencing what it feels like when, you know, those other chemicals kick in and you start moving and really pick up the emotional and the mental impacts of that process. So I think, and I think that the process for me was I really picked that up during the 2018 Tathra bushfires. The then Mayor of the Bega Valley Shire Council and I, and obviously we had significant house loss, business loss, impact on communities' lives. And that was in March, and it really wasn't until after we'd had another significant fire in August of that year that physically I felt like I'd been run over by a bulldozer. It literally had a physical impact that there was a physical manifestation of. And I think that knowing that to a certain extent, when we went into then the 2019-20 fires, I was aware of that, and I was aware of that on behalf of the people around me and the work that we did with you and during those 2018 fires, and having that in front of our thinking all the time really put us in a really good place. So I think that's the main thing for me. I think it was really needing to understand that you move into operating by rote, and you've got to do these things, and it's a very intense time, but you've got to take care of yourself, because as a lead in an organisation in recovery, relief, or in response, you need to be making sure that you're on your best game. And being aware of those things is really, really important. If you're going to communicate with community, you're going to be working with people whose lives have been significantly impacted, you're going to take on a whole range of those emotions, and that flows into yours, and you need to be managing that. I think for working with the organisation, one of the key things looking back is making sure that you are aware of that for the rest of your organisation as well, making sure that you do critical incident stress debrief, and that's written into your recovery plan as something that switches on very, very quickly, particularly in regional and rural Australia when we have disasters like this. It is the people in your organisations, within your emergency services, that actually are personally impacted, but also know a lot of people, know most of the people in many instances that are impacted. So being able to sit down and run through very quickly and switching that on, we did it after a period of time in 2018, but then being able to switch it on very quickly in January 2020, I think was significant. So it's about looking after the people, because in local government, in relief and recovery, it's going to be those staff that are the ones that walk with community, that are helping them through the things that they need to do to get their lives back into some sort of frame where that they can start to even think about recovery. So that's really important. And I think for the community, the key thing that I look back and would say to myself is to do the communications, to walk with community, to listen and to listen, and to then feed back on those key things so that you listen to the people. And sometimes you'll be, and you talk about it a lot when we talk with the training and support that you've given to councils, but bushfire brain is a real thing. It's real in our organisations, but for community, it is very much real for them. And so things manifest over a period of time, and quite often people aren't in a space to be able to really hear what's said a first time, and they need to tell their story or ask their questions, and you need to be able to walk with them, listen, and then go back to them and close that circle for them, provide the answers. And sometimes it might be really frustrating to you, think, oh, I've already given you this information, but that's because they weren't in a mindset to be able to take that on board. And you've actually got to be able to do that in terms of working those processes through. So having those personal aspects written into recovery planning, I think, is absolutely critical, because it's about people. And you can have your process of rolling big red trucks or SES support people, absolutely fantastic, in to help physically in those processes of response. But when we move into recovery, it really is listening to and being with people, both yourself, those people in your organisations, and then also those people in the community. I think, in summary, looking back at where we should be and where I think the learning of experiences of being in multiple disasters has left us, is in understanding that we need to be much better prepared and planned in the recovery space. We do an enormous amount. I've chaired local emergency management committees. I've been through those exercises we do all the time on, there's a plane crash at the Merimbula airport, or there's an ocean tanker spill in Twofold Bay. And we've done all of those, desktop and real, rolled them out. But I really get a sense that our recovery planning needs to be much more front and centre. I think that what I've learned is that there should be recovery representatives in there with their recovery hats on, sitting around the local emergency management committees, as they're called in New South Wales, and different names in other states. We need to be constantly thinking about when's the transition happening from response through to relief into recovery, and then, feeding into building resilience out of that. The other thing, I think, in terms of the experience and what I've been through, is the importance of communication. It's about that constant communication to everybody. So doing the processes of making sure the community on a daily basis, sometimes even shorter, every couple of times a day, are across all of the things that are happening, that the media are kept up to date, that the various agencies, politicians and whatever. So it's about that communication and that information going through, because I think we forget sometimes, and you just aren't aware of all of the complex overlays that sit within the recovery space and where they are, and how everybody's journey is at a different point and a different time, and it's really up and down. Response is quite, lineal, and it's quite, we're going to do this, we're going to deal with these sorts of issues. But when you move into the recovery phase, it really is a business might recover in the short term, but have longer term issues. An individual with their loss of their home, or more importantly, loss of loved ones, their journey is going to be really, really complex, and it takes time. And so working through that process of walking with community, I think, is absolutely critical. and coordinating that. So one of the things that I think is really important, and I spoke about it a little bit earlier, is the fact that quite often in recovery, we expect those people that are so directly impacted to tell their story to half a dozen different agencies over and over and over again. And I think the better coordinated, when we switch that, response, move into relief, move into recovery, to be able to say, we've got approvals, or we want your approval now that you're telling us your story, that we can share that information. I think some of those aspects I've really seen in real time now, and understand. You can read whatever you like. You can read your national principles of disaster recovery and your work. Until you walk through it, sometimes you don't really understand the impact of it. But those principles are there, and they're there for a very good reason, because they've been pulled together by people that have been through this a number of times. So I think they're the things that I've really learned, is that the learning, the processes. We don't want to talk very much sometimes about recovery because, lights and sirens are a bit more sexy, but the recovery stuff is long term, and you've got to be there for all phases of it. And we've got to look at those principles, and we've got to implement those in the plans and roll that out, and practice it as well. I think, it's a good question, because as with recovery, as with moving into being a someone who's working in recovery rather than someone that's recovering, when we use those words, I think it's different, and everybody does it differently and experiences it differently. And I think one of the things we need to be ready for and plan for is that it will affect each individually differently. And I know she won't mind me sharing this, but Christy McBain, when she was the mayor of the Bega Valley Shire Council, talks about having her emotional box that she used during recovery. She actually put all of those feelings and the personal stuff into the box so she could be there for her community, so she could be through go through the walking with, and have as much capacity to take on and support the needs of the people in her community. She talks about the fact that how she felt when her emotional box was full, and it started full. That's when she felt like she'd been run over by a bus. And I think one of the ththings that it really manifested for us in the Bega Valley Shire Council through the follow-on from 2018 through to 2019-20 was that constantly asking, are you okay? How are you travelling? Do you need support? Just touching base, constantly getting, we had the critical incident stress people come in, but constantly getting them back just to touch base, because someone mightn't say something in front of a group of people, but you just pick up on those, are you okay? There's a little signal there that someone needs some support. And I think it was different for everybody. And sometimes it was a trigger, something that someone spoke to them about that actually triggered there being a bit of a, oh my gosh moment. And it was about constantly speaking, communicating, and listening to how people were going, and doing that not just once or twice, but consistently over the period of time, and rolling that out continually. And I think some of the emergency service agencies do critical incident stress debriefing quite well. They do it in, after major fires and whatever, they do it as a process. It's not something in some of the recovery agencies so much that we've actually instilled into, say, something like a local council or some of the other agencies. And I think that's something that we really need to be doing, to let people know that it is okay, that things are going to build up for them sometimes. Some people will go through and deal with it and move on and they'll be fine. Other people, it'll be a trigger, or it'll be a build-up, because these things become exponential. And then all of a sudden they get to a point and then they go, whoa, not feeling so good. And sometimes people haven't been through that before, so they don't know what they're reacting to. So I think it's really important that in the recovery planning in particular, in recovery plans, that's actually in there as an integral part of that. I think in terms of you don't want to be in recovery, you don't want to be having to have had a disaster, whether it be a fire or a flood or even something like COVID. But I think what it does do is, from an organisational perspective in local government, us working together to support community on something that impacted those people that we care and love for and work for has been absolutely integral in breaking down some of the organisational silos in local government, so that the planning people were getting help from some of the library staff that would come in and help them process things, so that they could help people move through with their development applications. Being able to do that in an organisation was absolutely critical. And also in terms of responding or recovering from disasters, the things that we would do and some of our teams did as a local government body out in community were quite different too, because everybody got all hands on deck. This is the high priority. At the moment, you know, the term, I don't think we should ever use it again, but so many people early on in the disaster framework will say, when will we get back to business as usual? And I think it's about saying business as usual has gone. We are now talking about how we are responsive and thinking to the future in this space. And if we need to take resources from this project to move to a program over here to support our community, do things differently, that's what we do. So I think that that's really important. In community, I think one of the key things that I've seen with responding to then recovering from a number of disasters in our community is sometimes the quite unlikely alliances, you know, those matches made in heaven between different groups working together to achieve things. So, and support their community and get outcomes. I think that, and those things, sometimes they'll be there for a short period of time, but other times they're quite long-term relationships that see us working in a different way. And I think they're a couple of the things that I think are unbelievably positive that come out of response, that if we hadn't been challenged and had to on the spot think about how we do things differently, that perhaps it might have taken 5 years, if at all, that we would have got there. And there's a good program. And I think, you know, one of the things in that space that I think about now is how adaptive we've been in the response and recovery to COVID in doing things differently online, and how things like the Local Government Act in response to the bushfires in 1920 and the Planning Act and response to COVID changed, where there had been push to change things for 5-10 years, they changed within a matter of weeks. And I think it shows that we can do it. So let's take those positives and put them on the table and keep them going for the future. One of the things that I think is really critical about having in our recovery toolkit and our recovery planning is communications and the various roles that our organisations and our politicians and leaders of organisations play in this, and the information that's provided to them. So from a local government perspective, obviously it's about rolling in and saying that mayor is the spokesperson. That mayor is the person who is given the information provided to all councillors, but is the one that does the media, is supported to get the messaging out and to take things back. But very clearly in that process within the local government space, it's about making sure that all councillors are kept across all issues and that they know and can put a rope around how they feed that information in, get response back to people, or are assured that that's happening. The other overlay is obviously dealing with local members, local state members, local federal members, senior politicians, and in many instances you do get visits from premiers and prime ministers and the Governor General, is making sure that there's a framework about how that is supported and managed, and how it is seen to be part of a rebuilding and a recovery process rather than something which is a challenge in that space, because it's quite time consuming when you're focusing in on supporting people commence the process of rebuilding their lives, to also then have to pull off to stage right to be able to deal with, visiting people and media and all those other groups that come in. It's very important that that is managed, and everybody, prior to there being an event, it's got to be done well in advance, understand what the various roles are, and are assured that they will have the information that they need, so that people don't go off script, because that can be very confusing for community. And I think in the community space too, it is about making sure that you are constantly meeting with community groups, going to their place, listening to them, their issues, and being there when there are various agencies or politicians there, so that you can continue to support and build them. And I think by building that in and having community voices helping you develop your recovery plan before there's an incident, then everybody's then able to, we've talked about this in the good times, we now need to roll it out because we're responding to, there's been an event or an incident, we know where we go in this space, and it's much easier to put a rope, not to put a rope around it, but to manage it and make it a positive contributor to the recovery process, rather than being something that is taking energy away from the core focus.